The Athletic. The race is on, and Lewis Hamilton ended his 2.5-year win drought with his 9th British Grand Prix victory in a thrilling dry, wet, dry race. But how did McLaren suffer defeat this time? And can we take this as definitive proof that Mercedes is back? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to unpack everything from Silverstone are Scott Mitchell-Malm, Mark Hughes, and Samarth Kanal. Mark, British Grand Prix.
Yes.
It's been great, hasn't it?
It has. It's been glorious, and it's been sort of familiar because so many times that the British weather has done this, has just sort of randomised the whole event and made it much more exciting. Obviously, the price that the fans had to pay for that is to get a good soaking every now and again. But hopefully they deemed it worthy. And it was just a cracking Grand Prix. Even putting aside the fact that we had the top three in qualifying, all Brits for the first time since 1968, and the first time ever here. Even putting aside the patriotism, which I can take or leave, it was still a cracking Grand Prix.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Any Grand Prix, a home win is good. So we'll be all cheering on Zolt Baumgartner next time out in Hungary. Scott, how about for you? Any detours you'd like to grumble about?
We had a long journey back on Saturday night with the traffic management system. That was quite fun. 45-minute journey turned into an hour and a half, but I think a lot of hardier souls than us had trickier paths to trek, some quite literally walking through a lot of mud and rain. Mark was alluding to, you get good soaking from time to time. The other price I had to pay was quite steep ticket prices this year, but I would really hope that, and the response I got from quite a few fans that have told me sort of how their experience has been this weekend, that it was worth it. I think there's been a few kind of like lifetime kind of core memory kind of things that have been enjoyed this weekend. Not just people that were here to see Lewis Hamilton win again in Formula One, which I think for a lot of the fans is going to mean a lot to them. But even on Saturday evening, they Mercedes did a really good job with the timing of the appearance of Hamilton and George Russell on the main stage. It coincided with the end of the England football match, the quarterfinals of the Euros. And the way it was timed, Hamilton and Russell watched the penalty shootout basically with all the fans on the main stage, and I can imagine there's lots and lots of fans going home this week. They'll be able to tell everybody that they watched England win the quarterfinals on pens with Hamilton and Russell literally with them. So that's quite cool. And then the Grand Prix itself wasn't too shabby either.
It's a shame there wasn't a Swiss representative for that. I don't know. Baron de Grafenried maybe would have been a good one, a former British Grand Prix winner, of course.
Well, Mark Surer was here.
Yeah, Mark Surer.
That's another one, yeah. There's been a few, haven't there? Samarth, any lifelong memories you've made here?
Firstly, it's good to be back, actually, because I think my last appearance on this was Australia or something, because I missed Imola. I was a bit, let's just say I was a bit iffy there.
You're not getting enough bookings, that's what you're complaining about.
I'm not. Yeah, I got to call my agent. It's been unforgettable. It's been absolutely brilliant. And, my sympathies to the fans who have kind of gone through a lot to kind of get here, and it's soaking, there's traffic, but they have witnessed something amazing this weekend. I mean, and like Mark, I can probably take or leave the Britishness, although there's some pride there, fine. But what a result. Really interesting. And, it's amazing to see Lewis Hamilton break a drought that's lasted 3 years. I mean, I think he alluded to, saying that he had some doubts during that period. And, what a story.
It's amazing, really, that Lewis Hamilton winning the British Grand Prix in a Mercedes can seem like a bit of a novelty and a surprise, doesn't it? It tells you what the last few years have been like.
Well, when he's literally just broken, like, he now stands alone, doesn't he, as the holder of the most wins at a single circuit. Like, we are so used to Hamilton winning at Silverstone, and yet it feels incredibly fresh and meaningful that he's done it. That probably sums up that last sort of the 2.5-year journey he's been on better than anything else.
No, absolutely. And what was remarkable, though, is there were probably 5 drivers in contention for victory, Mark. So can you just explain exactly how it played out at the front and the key moments? Yeah,
so it was 3 phases. It started off the track more or less dry, but there was a big cloud coming, and that first phase we saw the Mercedes leading 1-2, George ahead of Lewis, ahead of the 2 McLarens, and that looked to be the sort of natural order in that sort of initial dry phase. Everybody on medium tyres. Then, as the cloud came and there was decision to be made about when to pit or whether or not to pit. And pretty much everyone up at the front decided that the shower was minor enough that it would be quicker to just brave it out and stay on the slicks, stay on the mediums, and get through to the next drive phase. And that when they were in that phase, the McLarens were just so much faster than anything else. And Lewis was faster than George. So initially it was that phase which allowed Lewis to overtake George, but then both McLarens to overtake both Mercs. And that was how it was going into the next dry phase, as it were, with everyone still on their original tyres. Max Verstappen was some way distant from there and was even being pressured by Carlos Sainz's Ferrari for a time. The next decision point came as the second big cloud arrived, and this one was a much more serious rainfall and was predicted to last quite accurately for about 10 laps. And there were some tricky decisions to be made on the pit wall and in the cockpits. And this is where Red Bull and Max Verstappen were the gold standard. They really played it blind and got the timing absolutely spot on. Turns out lap 26 was the lap to do it. The Mercedes, the two Mercedes came in the following lap, which entailed Russell being stacked, and that lost him some time. But as it turned out, it didn't really alter anything because he was out not long after with a water pressure suddenly reducing, indicating imminent PU failure. So that left just McLaren. So they brought Lando in on the same lap as the two Mercs, but they left Oscar Piastri out there, and that was their first. Well, the two tactical mistakes in that. They should have pitted the lap earlier, as should Mercedes, and they should have, once they'd decided it was going to be lap 27, they should have brought Piastri then in as well and stacked him, which would have lost him some time, but not as much time as he lost trailing round on one slicks in the wet. So that dropped him a long way back. Lost him about 18 seconds, actually.
He basically came out with Norris, didn't he?
Yeah.
He was asked after the race, what did you think when you saw that? And he said, I probably shouldn't repeat that. Good job I didn't have the radio open.
Yeah. So, very, very unfortunate call, and coming immediately after his unfortunate penalty in qualifying in Austria, which arguably lost him that race. It's a really very difficult one for him to take, I'm sure. And then he lost further time being stuck behind the Ferrari Carlos Sainz. So that really took him out of the equation because he could have been in the mix. So it then came down to to Lando versus Lewis, with Max apparently quite distant from them. And later into the stint, Lewis was catching Lando. And because the Merc was being better to the tyres, or Lewis was being better at the tyres, by the end of the stint, just as it was coming to when we're going into the final phase of the race, the next dry phase, he was in position to undercut Lando. So McLaren didn't respond to that, which was unfortunate, and Lewis undercut himself ahead. Max came in on the same lap as Lewis, Lando a lap later. Lewis was on softs because they didn't have any mediums. The medium was by far the best tyre. Max went on to hards, again, because he didn't have any mediums. And McLaren kept mediums back for both Piastri and Lando. Piastri went onto them, but there was a lot of indecision in the Lando Will Joseph discussion, not only about timing but also about which tyre to put on. And they decided to cover Lewis, so therefore opted for the soft when they had a perfectly good brand new set of mediums there. And it was, the soft just wasn't as good a tyre. So Lewis undercut himself ahead of Lando, which was the winning of the race for him. And all he had to do then was make sure he stayed ahead of Verstappen, who was on the harder tyre, able to track Norris down and overtake him, and was within a couple of seconds of Lewis at the flag, but probably needed another 3 or 4 laps to have been able to put a move on the Mercedes. But so it was a lovely fairy tale story. But in terms of what the performance order should have been. You can't help but think McLaren should have been 1-2, and then they made several key tactical errors, and Mercedes capitalised, and so did Max and Red Bull.
Yeah, certainly true. We've got a few quick fire the Race Members Club questions just for short answers. Daniel Ingerton says, why didn't McLaren put Lando on that extra set of mediums for the final stint?
They wanted to cover Lewis. They felt that Lewis was the bigger threat than Verstappen, which because he had been in up to that phase of the race. But they discussed it. Do we cover Max and put the hards on, or do we cover Lewis and put the softs on? And Norris said Lewis. So,
Michael Griggs says, did Lewis show he was still the tyre master today with his ability to bring in the soft compared to Max on the hards?
He did bring the softs in very, very nicely in that final stint. They required a lot more maintenance than the hards. The hards he could push pretty much all the way, so Max didn't have much tyre nursing to do, Lewis did. But yeah, they're both extremely good at tyre whispering. So I wouldn't say he showed that he was better than Max. Max had a much easier task there.
Kevin King says, where was Max's pace up until the last stint on hards? I expected more from him.
Yes, he was. The car was never quite happy on that first stint. It wasn't ever particularly happy in qualifying. He damaged it. Without the damage, I think he'd probably been contending for pole. And from there, we might have seen a quite different race. But yes, he was just. That's just how the car's behaviour played out at the different phases of the race.
And Robin B says, does Russell struggle more than Hamilton, Norris and Verstappen and Piastri in wet conditions?
He certainly did today, yes, but I'd be uncomfortable about stating that as a blanket observation. But yes, certainly today, Lewis was much more at ease in the wet, and the McLaren, which is loaded with quite a bit more downforce than the Mercedes, was naturally quicker in the wet.
Excellent answers there. Scott, let's get on to Hamilton himself now. His last win was in the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix in 2021, penultimate race of that season, just over 2.5 years ago. So how big a deal was this victory for him personally?
Oh, massive. You could tell that there was a combination of obviously ending this wind drought and doing it here. I think it would have been a big reaction from him anyway, like wherever he won this race, just because of those doubts that Samarth was mentioning when you introduced him on the podcast. And also just the process, I think, that you go through mentally when you're a driver at this stage of his career, when the team's been through the few ups and many downs that it's had since the start of 2022. We know from the end of last year that Hamilton was questioning himself through this process and wondering how much of it was the car, how much of it was him. So to have gone through all of this for the first time in his career, he's had bad moments in his career. Of course, he's had difficult seasons, but there was such a long, sustained run of success through the hybrid era with Mercedes. He only really knew how to win with Mercedes, with the exception of the first season and, of course, 2016. Lost out in 2021 in controversial circumstances, and then it obviously, compared to their standards, nosedives from 2022 onwards. Now, Hamilton's performances within that have still largely been on the good side. He was, championship-wise, obviously marginally worse off than Russell in 22, better than him in 23. He's maybe lost a tiny edge of pace versus Russell in qualifying this year, but he's still been pretty much there or thereabouts. It's just sometimes the gaps have meant that the positional gap on the grid is bigger than it perhaps should be, given those fine margins. Most of the Sunday performances have still been strong. There are occasions where he has difficult ones, like Austria last weekend, but sometimes there are extenuating circumstances. It's been a proper rollercoaster, is what I'm saying, for the last couple of years, and to almost get off that with this victory, you could just tell that there was a weight on his shoulders that he probably hasn't experienced, if not before, for a very long time. And it's a great story for F1 to have a titan like him back winning again, but just on a personal level, you could see what it meant to him.
So, Mark, do you think it'll shut up all of those who think he's over the hill?
Oh boy, I don't want to incur the wrath of those people, but yeah, I think it definitely will, and definitely. I'm just taking the mick, as it were, but yeah, definitely, I think it will. I think at times I've seen him be a bit down this season and last season as well. I mean, it's very clear in his kind of body language and the kind of way he talks to the media, and forgive my choice of words, it comes off as stroppy sometimes, which sounds kind of insulting, but I don't mean it to be that way. It just comes off as this almost acceptance that he's just not going to come back, and I think today could be a real turning point.
Well, and winning racing drivers, when they're not winning, do get stroppy, don't they? That's
Which is
not
completely
unusual.
fair. Yeah, I mean, it's completely fair in a way. I mean, you used to be in the best, and as Scott said, he's experienced periods of difficulties before, but this was an intense one. I don't think it's going to be a false dawn. I think he's going to have a couple more good results this season.
You probably also can't rule out the emotional significance of getting that win with Mercedes. I don't think he's mentally he has not checked out. A drive like this shows that he's still fully focused and capable of these moments where he digs incredibly. He was so locked in that final stint. It was absolutely flawless up against a car that was chasing him down, Max Verstappen's Red Bull. But emotionally, you could have thought, where's he at emotionally in terms of he's made his peace with the fact that he's leaving Mercedes. He's got to focus on that move to Ferrari at some point in the future, and that's where his future lies. So you could have questioned, actually, how strong is that tie to Mercedes now the bond has been broken or will be broken in a few months' time. I think, just look at the way that the whole team reacted. Look at the messages over the radios telling Bono that he loves him. It showed that there's, still that heart, that connection there. I think given everything they've gone through, the way they lost in 2021, the fact that he hadn't won since then as well, to taste victory with Mercedes again is a big deal for him. It ticks a box and helps close that chapter when he finally leaves at the end of the year. There isn't quite that same what if.
6 different winners this year now as well, which is something we didn't see coming at the start of the year.
Vintage season. Exactly.
I mean, 21 was the last time we had 6 winners, and that was something of a classic, wasn't it? But Mark, I think we can be absolutely definitive that Mercedes are on the right track now, aren't they? We had that impression already, but the Austria win, okay, it relied on a collision, and maybe the way the race played out here allowed Mercedes to win a race that in a completely dry race they might have struggled to, but it's thereabouts, aren't they?
Yeah, they're thereabouts, and so it's close enough that within the noise of different track conditions and track layouts, you can get it skewed one way or another, but there's no reason to suppose that they won't be in a position to challenge for further wins in the remainder of the season. So I think that's quite safe now. We've been on quite a variety of track layouts and weather conditions, and it's been there or thereabouts. Not probably as quick as a McLaren, not quite yet. And the peak of the Red Bull is probably still the fastest, but it's a bit more sensitive, a bit more awkward than the McLaren. McLaren's probably the best all-rounder, but the Mercedes is not far behind it now.
The thing that I really liked is if you look at qualifying, it all just brings it down to execution, doesn't it? We saw, obviously, Verstappen had the Q1 off, did some damage, did a really good job to qualify 4th with the damage, but he kind of took himself out of the pole fight effectively. Lando Norris could have probably been on pole, but didn't execute perfectly. George Russell did. Lewis Hamilton had the machinery. So this is great, isn't it, Scott? Because we've now got it exactly where we want it, in that there's probably 3 teams going into any weekend who can realistically win a fairly normal race, and Ferrari's only recently sort of slipped out the back of that. Great.
Yeah, it is. And I know that people don't get massively excited about the Constructors' Championship fight, but that is a genuine title battle that will, at this rate, emerge as the season goes on. The irony is that at a time when Red Bull has been under more pressure and losing more often than at any point over the last couple of years, it's been extending its championship lead, because the only team in that group that's been sucking a bit over the last few races is Ferrari, which was erstwhile the closer challenger. I think it still might be, but it's just kept falling away. They're getting away with the fact they've only got one car in the fight. So that's going to change. We're only halfway through the season, and at this rate, Red Bull will be caught, if not by Ferrari, but by McLaren and Mercedes, and Mercedes would have taken a big chunk out of Red Bull this weekend if Russell hadn't retired. So you've got that to look forward to. That is a championship narrative, which will mean something on track. That'll impact what we see trackside. But then you've got the race-by-race narrative as well, and you've also got this fascinating element of this is all building to 2025 and potentially a multi-car, multi-driver title fight. And it does make you wonder, why do we need new regs in 2026? So let's just keep this going.
No, it's brilliant, isn't it? The funny thing is, it's just unpredictable. We talked about this morning when we were driving in for a little social media video that we thought Verstappen might potentially come through to win this one. We didn't have a great read on the dry weather long run pace, so we were guessing a bit. But Verstappen drove a really good race and Red Bull executed well. He still didn't win, so you just don't know where it's going, which is fantastic. Right, Mark, let's talk about Red Bull in a bit more detail, because Verstappen did come close to winning but fell just short. How surprised were you by the way it's going for that team?
Oh, if you'd asked me 3 or 4 races ago, that I would have, and you told me what was about to happen, I would have been surprised. But we've seen it in incremental stages, haven't we? We've seen McLaren prove robust on all sorts of circuits. We've seen Mercedes make the breakthrough with the front wing and really start chipping away at that former deficit. So, not that surprised. If you could come into any weekend, it's no longer a given that Red Bull and Max are probably going to be on top of this one. It's not. They're still probably favoured, you would say, but it's by no means a certainty anymore.
That gradual manifestation of that narrative is a really good point, actually, because if you go even more extreme with it, not just the last few races, if you went back to Bahrain, I know we've joked about this a couple of times, haven't we, about we were all thinking after Bahrain, we probably even said on this podcast to you, good luck finding 24 ways to write this over the course of the year. If you went from Bahrain to now, if you told someone in Bahrain this would be the case in 12 races' time, it would be really hard for people to buy into. But bit by bit, you have seen the erasure of all of that advantage. You've seen elements of the Red Bull in terms of limitations exposed. You've seen Perez fall away as a support act for Verstappen. You've seen McLaren upgrade its car, come good on the stuff it was saying pre-season about wait until we get upgrades on the car. We've seen Mercedes start to figure it out. And all of a sudden, you layer all of that onto what we saw in Bahrain, and actually, this does make sense. But I can't be the only one who is quite relieved, because we've said it countless times. Doesn't matter if Verstappen wins. Okay, he didn't today, so what? The race just needs to be good, and it was again today.
No, absolutely. I think Verstappen's showing a few signs of being a bit irritated with Red Bull, in that he's obviously been pushing this the problems with the car for quite a while and sort of being told, this is fine. And I think there's a little bit of tension there in terms of the development as well, because it's getting very, very difficult for them, which is interesting. And of course, Sergio Perez, bit of a disastrous weekend, frankly. I mean, Samarth going off in Q1 on a outlap. Not great, is it?
Yeah, it's just exactly the weekend he did not need. And, with Liam Lawson coming in to test the car next week, I can't imagine the pressure he's under now. Actually, well, I can, because we saw him in the pen after qualifying, and it was a bit waffly. He was just saying things like, I'm committed to Red Bull, and there was no real answer about his form right now, and he's going to really need to find it soon.
I was actually quite amused by that answer. That was on after qualifying, and the suggestion that Checo's own commitment to Red Bull was the thing that was the problem here. And it's like, well, we know that you want to keep this drive, Checo, but it's whether Red Bull wants to keep you. That's what matters. I mean, this has come at a terrible time, but it is just an extension of the existing form we've seen. He's been started in the top 10 once in the last 6 races. He scored, I think, 15 points in that time, fallen to 6th in the championship. He's got less than half Verstappen's points now, and he was only about 30 or 40 points off after Miami, which was 6 races into the year. I said, Red Bull's really lucky that it hasn't been caught in the constructors, but Checo's been really badly exposed with this form, and now there's even talk that Red Bull is starting to consider the last resort, which is dumping him mid-season, and that would be a massive change, especially as there's no cast iron, really good option to plug in place of him. That's kind of also an indication of how dire the situation is, because if there was an absolute megastar in waiting for Red Bull, a young Red Bull protege killing it in RB in the second team, looking like they're really, really pushing at the Red Bull Racing door, you'd kind of think, okay, there's a lot of pressure from underneath as well. They don't have a replacement for him, and they're still considering replacing him. That's the situation that they're in.
15 points in the last 6 races for Perez. Obviously started from the pit lane, had a difficult race, gambled on Inters, that was worth doing, but anyone who went onto Inters early had a bit of a disaster, so that wasn't that was just an unsalvageable race for him. Right, let's talk about Ferrari, Scott. Firmly 4th best at Silverstone. Carlos Sainz resoundingly 5th. although he got that fastest lap bonus point. But what did you make of Leclerc's race?
Miserable, and obviously completely ruined by that. It's not even a decision that you can justify in the moment, let alone with and then criticise with hindsight. Like, it was, I think we all must have thought, what the hell are they doing when they did that? Now, Leclerc rationalises the decision to pit for intermediates when the track wasn't really wet, because he felt that the track was wet where he was at the time, which I think coming up to Stowe, I think it was...
Well, he said he said initially in the first sector, OK, right, we'll box. And then he was approaching Beckett's and he said, well, let's just think about this because it's dry in some parts. And then he gets sort of onto the hangar straight and he's like, box. Yeah. So he's reacting to what's right in front. And he's being told there's 10 minutes of rain at the same time.
He was being told that it was going to be heavy rain as well. So I think it was an overreaction to what he felt in the car, but I think he was steered in the wrong direction by that information. He obviously got it wrong. Ferrari got it wrong as a team. So the race unravelled from there. But it was a terrible weekend anyway. You know, he honestly seemed broken after the race. I've seen some clips of him speaking to TV. He was no better when he came over to us, and he just seems so fed up. He's basically, I think he's described it as 4 weekends in a row. So it's worse than a nightmare. And obviously, to cap it all off, this was also a weekend in which Ferrari had to take their upgrade off the car. That's how bad things are for that team at the moment.
Yeah, this was the Spain upgrade, which was just another small step, building on the Imola upgrade, so a bit more aggressive side pod undercut, a few little floor tweaks, and they introduced it in Spain, and they've been having porpoising problems in the high speed. When they're in lower speed range corners, it works well, but that's no good because you can't stop it bouncing. And this is a problem that's been there a little bit all year, and as they've developed the car, it's become more of a problem. So yeah, back-to-back the cars on Friday, decided to go with the old spec simply because it was more drivable, a little bit slower, but the other one, Leclerc, was all over the place with, so a sound decision there. But they've got some serious work to do. They obviously would like to bring it back in Hungary, but they need to make some changes. I think there's some fundamental learning they need to do to be able to run the car as low and aggressively as they want to generate the downforce. Others have learned that lesson. Ferrari needs to learn it now, or they're going to be left behind by that top three group of teams. Let's talk about Aston Martin now, Samarth. They were poor in Spain and Austria, but actually in decent shape at Silverstone with Lance Stroll 7th, Fernando Alonso 8th. So what's gone right there?
So I think they could have actually done slightly better had they executed Q3 a bit better with Alonso. I think he could have probably been ahead of Stroll. And actually Stroll said he could have beaten Hulkenberg today if not for the rain. But I also think, so 2 non-scoring races of Spain and Austria. Before that was Canada, and actually temperatures were quite low there. And look, I think the implication there is that they do go better in lower temperature races. Maybe they're a lot harder on their tyres than other teams and where they'd like to be. They are bringing upgrades to Hungary, track-specific and performance upgrades. So, you know, there's kind of room to improve. But if the temperature and conditions aren't right, they might face another race kind of battling for that P10, P11 spot. That's what I think.
Yeah, it's all a little bit Mercedes, their problem, isn't it, Mark? And obviously that point about temperature is interesting. I will jump ahead to what I was going to ask you about Williams, because this is something Alex Albon suggested benefited Williams in terms of the temperature, because they were back on form. Albon was 9th. Logan Sargent had a good weekend just outside the points. So their turnarounds, partly a similar thing, isn't it? That the conditions and the track seem to work for them.
Yeah, and it's not unique. I mean, you probably see it more starkly on the Williams and the Aston, but it's there also. On the Mercedes, you see the Mercedes is usually a little bit better in the cooler conditions than hotter ones. The McLaren seems to work very well relative to the others in hotter conditions. And you see the Red Bull in and out of phase throughout a weekend, especially this weekend, just according to what the tyres are doing. And it's, that, you know, what the track temperatures are and what compound they're on. They're all, this generation of cars is even more sensitive to the tyres than ever before.
Yeah, that's a constant complaint. Obviously, the tyres have worked quite hard with the downforce gain, so getting the same spec tyres as we had last year. And in fact, it was Silverstone last year, wasn't it, where the tyre spec was slightly changed. So this is the first direct like for like. But I think it's worth a brief mention of Logan Sargent. He had spec parity and did have a very good weekend. You could probably argue this was his most convincing complete weekend in F1. Maybe a little bit too late, but at least he's got a car. He needs to make a good impression, even if he is dropped. Let's go back to talking about Haas now, Scott, because Hulkenberg just had a fantastic weekend, didn't he? Qualified and finished 6th. So what's he doing so right?
Well, it's more of a continuation, I think, of the level that he's been at all season. I actually think he was very good last year, but obviously the Sundays were just... didn't matter how good you were. You could have been great or terrible in last year's Haas. It wouldn't have made a difference on the Sunday. He is making a big difference in that midfield. He's very consistently at a very good level. And I think the Haas, which was upgraded for this weekend, was in a high place in the pecking order around this circuit. There was obviously a couple of big teams removed from the picture with no Leclerc, no Perez, which again raises the ceiling of what's possible. But speaks volumes for the job he's doing and also the job that Haas has done developing the car. I think we touched on this after Austria last weekend, that he's ahead of both Aston Martins. So a good weekend, a better weekend for Aston Martin still leaves them behind the lead Haas. It's hard to say exactly how much Hulkenberg is kind of doing differently to, let's say, not last year, but let's say his first stint in Formula One. I do think that these regulations and especially the 2022 era of car does seem to feed into or lean into sort of his way of driving. It seems to bring out the strengths and maybe mitigate some of the weaknesses. But he's making such great use of his machinery, and it's really, really hard to fault him. It was just another great drive today.
Yeah, very, very much so. And he's just doing the job week in, week out, isn't he? Yuki Tsunoda got a point as well. RB, obviously, they were a bit mix and match. They had what was characterised as kind of 50% of their Spain upgrade. They were having through corner balance difficulties with the full upgrades. That's something they're working on. We're seeing quite a lot of this at the moment with these tricky cars that upgrades go on. Sometimes they work, sometimes the characteristics aren't quite right. So some work being done from RB. The key is understanding how to make the best of it. And Tsunoda, did a good job to get into the points.
I just very quickly add, because there was a specific detail I should have mentioned on Hulkenberg, which was that he was one of the drivers who judged the rain really well and made the most of it, because he actually had he'd lost ground on the opening lap, but just
a horrible start.
Yeah, but didn't panic. Solid first stint running basically where you can run when you're in that kind of train. But then around the change to intermediates, that's where he was able to regain his ground. So smart, quick when it mattered, didn't throw it off, and then basically once he had that track position, he was never letting it go.
Actually, in those conditions, when you're in slicks in the wet, he's actually a bit Jenson Button-y in terms of his ability to drive to the grip, keep the tyre temperature there, and judge when you need to pit. He's very, very good at that. Brazil 2012 is the classic example of that, when it was him and Button disappeared miles up the road, having not changed. But yeah, Hulkenberg's got some great qualities, and it's great we're seeing them since he's had his return with Haas. Well, let's delve into our big bag of questions from the Race Members Club. It really is an ever deeper bag as we get so many, and thanks so much for that. We'll tackle more in an upcoming episode before Hungary, but we'll pile through as many as we can here. Remember as well to check out the link in the episode description or head to Patreon and search for the race to find out more about the benefits, and if you so choose, perhaps sign up yourself. Right, Mark, a question from Stuart Harland, who says, I count at least 3 bad calls from McLaren during that race. Is McLaren ready to consistently fight at the front for wins when competing against the likes of Red Bull, who rarely make bad calls on Max's side? And we had a similar question from Christopher Smith.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this on previous podcasts. The speed of the car, the competitiveness of the car is exposed, really, that McLaren aren't, quite battle hardened to run right at the cutting edge in terms of strategy calls. And I think you heard this most notably today with the radio conversations between Lando Norris and Will Joseph, which were they had certain parallels with Montreal and also Sochi a few years ago. And yeah, I think they need to become, Lando himself but also the operation of the team, they need to become much more decisive, and maybe the idea of involving the driver in the decision, whilst it sounds nice and egalitarian, is not really the most suitable way of doing it when in these high stress moments when you can't really expect the driver to have the full picture, especially in the quite stressful conditions of trying to keep the car on the road in a wet, dry race. So I think if you listen to GP and Max Verstappen, there's no ambiguity. Do you want to stay out for another lap? Yes. Do you want the hards or the soft? The hards. It's just really, but there's no. It doesn't really. That whole thing. What just they're much more accustomed to running at the front and getting used to what those sort of decisions feel like.
Yeah, I completely agree, Mark, actually. I'd just like to butt in there and just say that there's so much information being shared behind the scenes. I think actually every team is capable of making the calls that could win them a race if they had the car. I think they're not capable sometimes of sifting through that information, delivering it in the correct way. I mean, there's the conversations that are broadcast might be like 10% of what is said behind the scenes. There's so much chat, so much information, so much analysis happening. It's staggering. So I think, and it was clear today that I think Andrea Stella kind of implied that they just need a better way of sifting through it.
And it is a learning experience. You remember, Mark, when Red Bull first started winning 2009, 2010, a lot of wins left on the table in that period.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and although McLaren's a championship winning team, I think this is kind of a new version of McLaren. They're having to relearn all this because they had so long in the doldrums. Samarth, a question from Cody Van Dyke, who says, if it hadn't rained, we'd be looking at a clear one stopper. Why would Pirelli bring the 3 hardest compounds and not bring the softer ones to encourage more strategy in 2-stop races?
So this is a track that puts a lot of lateral load, a lot of stress on the tyres. High-speed corners can do that. And if Pirelli had brought the harder step, then the soft would have become the medium. And that would have basically put teams in a strategic kind of hole there. They would have just had a couple of options. Yeah, a 2-stop race is more exciting, but there's so much load being generated by these cars here. I mean, Pirelli said it was 10% more load this year than it was at the end of last year. So they're seeing way more than they anticipated. They always try and prepare for that. They did bring a new construction to this race last year, and they've been running that just for more strength. But frankly, I don't think the tyres can handle it. And I think the softs specifically here were dropping off really quickly. I mean, some drivers had it after 5 laps. Joe and Ocon particularly struggled in their first stints.
Races were ruined by starting on softs.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, that makes it more impressive what Hamilton did at the end, because if you watch his lap times, he kept them extremely consistent for a longer period. Yeah, so I just don't think it would be suitable to bring the softer compounds here.
Question for you, Scott, from Stranded Colourwork, who's been watching the Friday team representative press conference and says, would you be able to provide insight into the aggressively neutral tone of Toto Wolff's answer and clarify Toto's answer to Scott's question during the press conference? And he adds that it's widely entertaining watching James Vale, Zach Brown and Toto Wolff talking around the topic of Christian Horner and Ayo Komatsu looking uncomfortable and like he wants no involvement in it.
Yes, I think there's sort of 2 parts there. The Toto stuff is because he's... It's partly his accent, isn't it? It's partly that. It's partly because he's quite good at like just kind of deadpan delivery. He kind of has a little bit of fun with it sometimes. And then I think there's there's at least a dash of him being capable of being quite menacing with how he delivers stuff. And so when he's got the right topic that he's talking about, this comes across in that kind of delivery that is. Sometimes it's hard to read. You don't really know whether he's being like fully on the attack with what he's saying, or he's having some fun with it. That in question, I think, is a reference to when he was talking about how Max races and how Red Bull people talk about it. And I think there was a little dig at Christian Horner in there. And then I think in response to the question I asked, which was about the Mercedes Alpine engine prospect, Toto was basically, I think, trying not to dismiss the prospect of an Alpine engine deal without over-promising the turnaround time. So his point was, we've had some exploratory discussions, we are open to it, but they need to decide whether or not they're binning the Works Renault engine and actually going to commit to being a customer. And then if that happens, we're a long way from getting a deal done, which is significant in the driver market because Carlos Sainz has other options on the table than Alpine that want to get a deal done soon. But if he's going to pick Alpine on the merits of whether it's a Works team or has a Merc engine, he's not going to know that for quite a while by the sounds of it. So it's quite interesting. It was quite for quite a careful answer from Wolff in some ways. It was also very clear cut in terms of the actual detail that he was putting across.
Question now I'll take from Kay Lois, who says, what's going on at Ferrari with Charles Leclerc? Well, we covered his weekend. Should add to that as well that because he ran the new spec that they didn't continue through the rest of the weekend on Friday, he went into qualifying having not driven in the correct spec in the dry, so he missed out on Q3. I'm sure he'd have made Q3 if he'd had a normal weekend in that spec of car. But I think also we're seeing Ferrari struggling a lot. They've got this bouncing problem. I think he's almost trying to overdrive a bit to compensate, reaching for something. And sometimes when things are a little bit difficult, Carlos Sainz is a little bit better at just sort of sitting in with the car and just doing what it can do. He did that very well in Austria. He did that very well here this weekend. So I think Leclerc is just reaching for things a bit. And I think that Inter's call he made was partly motivated by wanting to try and thrust himself a little bit up the order, when actually in P7 he should have probably played it safe in that one. Mark, Rachel Hillman says, where does today's win rank among Lewis's previous 8 wins at Silverstone?
I can't remember them all. Obviously 2008, his first one stands out as the most startling demonstration of virtuosity. And earlier in the weekend, Hamilton himself nominated that as by far his most impressive drive. But the rest, they're all just a blur. I would have to sit down and analyse them all over again to recall how he won them. But it was an impressive controlled drive. He was quicker at the crucial stage than his teammate in the wet. He didn't overreact when the McLarens were faster in that phase of the race. He stayed within reach of them and then pressed home the attack later on. And then brought the tyres in very well, as we've discussed, and held off Max Verstappen. It was a beautifully judged and controlled drive. This might be a second best British Grand Prix victory, potentially. I'd agree. 08's, you can make a good case that's his greatest Grand Prix win, quite frankly. We were both there that day. It was absolutely extraordinary wet weather drive. But maybe ranking them all 8 in order is something we'll undertake at some point. Samarth, Ben Harwood says, with Kimi Antonelli's performance in the F2 sprint race, is it time to drop one of the underperforming drivers and give him a chance in F1? If Mercedes are that keen to get him in the car next year, surely Toto Wolff can convince James Vowles to put Kimi in the Williams. Worst case scenario, he scores the same amount of points as Sargent.
Yeah, I think it is time. I think he really proved himself on track there. In really tough conditions, he nailed a start, he nailed restarts, and he stretched his lead to like 8.6 seconds in the wet, which was really impressive. And it could have been more if there weren't all the stoppages. I think it was a consummate, professional, mature performance from Antonelli. And there's so many corners that say he has the pace to be in F1. I think it is time. I'd also like to say that he made a really good impression of himself in the press conference afterwards. It's normally quite empty, and he was swarmed by F1 journalists. It was like the room was full for once in an F2 press conference, which was actually really good to see. It was also funny to see the two F2 drivers alongside him kind of sighing and slumping on the sofa in boredom because every question was directed towards Kimi. But he handles the limelight well. He's been protected by Mercedes for sure, but I definitely think he's ready on and off the track.
Scott, a question from Oscar. I don't think this is from Oscar Piastri, but it is about Oscar Piastri. Because the question is there an unluckier driver on the grid than Oscar Piastri? Today at Silverstone, he had the bad luck of working with McLaren's strategy team, but there's been the track limits issue in Austria, the impeding grid penalty at Imola, Sainz's understeer, the safety car at Silverstone last year, and more.
Yeah, actually, you reading out that question just reminded me that we got a message from someone on Twitter earlier, which was sort of along these lines, basically asking if we should retire Valtteri Bottas' sympathy corner and have an Oscar Piastri sympathy corner on this podcast. I think there are definitely some circumstances this year that would merit it, and he was, if you felt sorry for him last week, when you consider that track limits penalty cost him a win with the way the race played out, you have to feel sorry for him again today, because with McLaren's bungled handling of this race, cost Piastri a nailed-on podium and for possibly a win. Not just, it was a McLaren one too, but Piastri would have been in win contention. He's very quick early on, but that final stint when he was on the tyre that Norris should have been on was super fast. Showed exactly how much pace was in that McLaren. I think he was quickest driver on track. I think he was several seconds faster than Verstappen over the course of that stint. And Verstappen obviously took time out of Hamilton, so that just shows you the speed that Piastri had. Very unlucky. We said coming into this weekend, didn't we, Ed, that we had high hopes for Piastri because he's got a good record here. He's quick here, rather. But it just didn't align. It has to soon. He's been so much better this season than I think some of the headline results or deficits to Norris make it look like. He deserved more this weekend, but he'll get there because he's a very good driver.
I'd be staggered if he doesn't win his first Grand Prix this year, possibly even more than one. I think it could I think that could be just around the corner. A question from Alex Raghunath, who says, Haas seems to have finally made an update work on their car in this rule set. Any insight into what they've done differently this time around compared to the problems they had last year? Yeah, they had a side pod inlet tweak and a floor tweak, seemed to work very, very well. Aikamatsu, the team principal, was talking about this, and I think he feels that they've improved the communications a lot. Last year, one of the big problems they had was they were developing the car in the wind tunnel, and they would, like, their aero tracker was going nowhere, the aero tracker that tracks the performance. And it took ages. Eventually Gunther Steiner intervened and said, hang on, we need to do something. And that led to the big change in direction. So I think there's better communication, a little bit better focus on the progress they're trying to make. And of course, they've got a good platform in the car. It's the Ferrari mechanical platform. They use the Ferrari wind tunnel. That's how we know that probably Ferrari's troubles aren't necessarily fundamentally down to the wind tunnel data they're generating or their mechanical platform necessarily. But they've got just a car that's very, very usable, and that's been a big focus for them, both in terms of the way it runs on the tyres, in the way it performs. Quite good all-rounder, that car now. Medium speed corners now, bizarrely, are its weakness. High speed were a bit of a problem, but they've improved, and low speed's always been good. So yeah, just Haas, they understand what they're trying to achieve and are just carrying on that line. Mark, a question from Janus van der Waal, who says, how high would you rate the possibility that Perez is not going to make the end of the season at Red Bull Racing?
I would say after this weekend, very high. I would say it's probable, because it's just woeful. You can't justify performances like that in the top team. It's not a sustainable situation, and it's a repeat pattern of the last two seasons, but much worse. And you could sort of get away with it when you had a second a lap on the field with your car, but you can't get away with it now when you have virtually nothing. And McLaren and Mercedes have got two such strong driver lineups. It's not. I don't even think it's likely.
We were wondering, weren't we, earlier, like what would the merit be of that new Perez contract if they're just going to drop him a couple of months later, regardless of whether there's some kind of logic to it. Like, I don't know, maybe you actually suggested this, Ed, so I'll give you credit for it. Maybe the new contract inserted some performance clauses that then made it easier to hold him to account and hold him to the standard that Red Bull needed him to. Horner had joked earlier in the weekend it was just to help his confidence, which is, I think, definitely more joke than serious, because I've never heard of a driver getting a new contract for being bad. So that wouldn't tally. But regardless of whether there's any kind of actual reason or rationale behind it, it's objectively going to look terrible for Red Bull to bin off a driver that you only just gave a new 2-year contract, in quote marks, to a couple of months ago.
Question for you, Samarth, from Paul Genge, who says, how worried are Red Bull that the Constructors' Championship is slipping away from them as they are being outscored by other teams having two high point-scoring drivers? Max did win it alone last year. This year he doesn't have that luxury.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Scott provided a really good answer kind of to this a bit earlier in the podcast, really. Yeah, Red Bull will be worried. I mean, today, it seemed that Christian Horner was trying to account for Perez's horrible weekend. And it just seems like Perez was down on his luck and he wasn't showing any routes of recovery. That is really concerning for a team that should be kind of well ahead in this Constructors' Championship than they are now, at least, or at least taking points off their rivals when their rivals aren't executing quite as well. Yeah, it's a tough position to be in. I think Red Bull are under threat.
71 points their lead is over Ferrari, which in the Constructors' Championship is not a huge margin with the amount of points you can win, but more of concern, 7 points further back are McLaren, and they're scoring pretty heavily with two cars whenever they both get to the finish with a relatively normal race. So yeah, they're a big threat. Got a question from Ed R Gaming, who says, did Ollie Behrman continue to impress Haas in his FP1 session, and did any of the other FP1 drivers do anything to stand out since teams are caring less about F2 this year? Also, does Haas give Behrman a different session plan than the other FP1 rookies, considering he's now being prepared for a race seat in 25?
So I'll answer the first and third bits together. He does continue to impress Haas there, not just with his speed and consistency on long runs and all of this, but just his conduct out of the car and also inside the car with his feedback, his maturity and everything. That continues to be something that they like about him. In terms of a different session plan, it's not different insofar as there's anything specific that they're kind of preparing him for next year. But he's got so much experience now in F1, which is such a silly thing to say for someone who's as young as he is. But he's familiar with that car. He's proven himself capable of holding his own in a Grand Prix already with Ferrari. So you can just give him a normal programme. he can run the race drivers FP1 program. We saw that in this weekend when I think he had the new upgrade package on his car, I think, and Hulkenberg was running the old package. You don't give that to a driver that you don't trust. And if you just, by point of comparison, as he asked about other FP1 drivers, Isaac Hadjar very clearly had a conservative Red Bull program. He looked like he's so much better than this, as his victory in the F2 feature race showed and his performance this season showed, and what he's done in other F1 cars. But he looked like he was driving an F1 car for the first time in that FP1 run. He just looked so tentative and nervous and keen not to crash. There's a difference there. And then the middle question, I'll just give a quick shout out to Franco Colapinto. He's actually one of the junior drivers that's getting FP1 outings and doing a good job in F2 this season. So he's actually, Williams is very happy with him. I think he's 5th in the championship. He had two top 5 finishes this weekend. It's not easy to do the FP1 outings and not let them compromise your main programme. But he conducted himself well. He only had a few days' notice of doing this. He had 2 simulator sessions, but he was 3.5 tenths slower than Albon. Good technical feedback, handled himself with good maturity. Williams, I think, were really impressed with what he did, and he caught my eye as well.
He certainly didn't look overwhelmed by the car, did he? When you were watching the in-car, he was quite aggressive with it. He's very confident.
I honestly, there were one or two times I watched a lot of his push laps on the soft, and there was 1 or 2 times where I was genuinely shocked at how aggressively he threw it into Cops, for example. He was doing a small confidence lift versus Albon was flat. Colapinto was maybe lifting to about 70% throttle, but the just sharpness, he was attacking corner entries. That's really great to see when you just see that body language of the driver behind the wheel, but also the car they're driving. It's nice to see a driver having some fun with the car that they're driving and not looking irresponsible with it as well.
And the final question I'll take from Kieran Woodward, who says, Oscar Piastri was getting a bit close to Lando Norris before the stop for intermediates. Did McLaren deliberately leave him out to screw his race so he wasn't a threat to Lando? On the basis it wouldn't have looked good on home soil for Norris to have been beaten by his teammate. No, it absolutely wasn't that. McLaren would have absolutely welcomed a victory for either driver in equal measure. They're not particularly bothered about whether it's a home win or not. They're just scrambling to try and convert this car pace into wins. It was just this slightly confused situation. Obviously, teams don't like double stacking if they can avoid it. They clearly should have done. There was the option to do so, they didn't get it right. So it was a little bit of decision-making paralysis, I think, because in the end, to avoid losing maybe a couple of seconds from the double stack pit stop, they basically lost 18 seconds. It was absolutely crazy. So yeah, there was no intent behind that. It was just self-destruction with strategic decisions. Well, thanks very much, Mark, Scott, and Samarth, for your insight. Loads to read on therace.com, so have a look on there. Our other podcasts as well, Bring Back V10's latest series of that is flying off the shelves as we speak, and our YouTube channel as well. Lots to watch on there, both long and short form. Well, after this frenetic triple header, we're going to have at least a few days between races this time, but stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.